And the next item, sir, is a letter that will be transmitted to the United Nations explaining that we are withdrawing from the Paris Climate Treaty.
On his first day in office, President Trump signed an executive order to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. Coined the Putting America First in International Environmental Agreements, the order seeks to immediately cease or revoke any purported financial commitment made by the United States under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. As outlined in the 2025 executive order, the president argues that these agreements steer American taxpayer dollars to countries that do not require or merit financial assistance in the interests of the American people. Promised in the presidential campaign and subsequently acted upon through controversial budget decisions and the installation of the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, the current administration seeks to decrease both international and domestic spending, all to lessen America's $36.22 trillion national debt. The withdrawal is unsurprising as it aligns with the expressed goals of the Trump administration and its changes to U.S. foreign policy, such as withdrawing from the World Health Organization and talks about pulling out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to know or even understand the basics of international politics or how the federal government should tackle the national debt. What I will do is examine the hidden costs of this decision, costs that will bleed the U.S. socially, financially, and environmentally, all while making us a pariah in the global race towards sustainability. The Paris Climate Agreement is an international treaty designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the effects of climate change by holding the biggest players accountable. I am, of course, simplifying the complex framework, but some of the fundamental tenets should speak for themselves. Recognizing the need for an effective and progressive response to the urgent threat of climate change on the basis of the best available scientific knowledge, also recognizing the specific needs and special circumstances of developing country parties, especially those that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, as provided for in the Convention. As of March 2025, Iran, Libya, and Yemen are the only countries that have not formally joined the agreement. The United States remains the only nation to have ever withdrawn from it. The Articles of the Paris Climate Agreement are explicit in their intentions and requirements for participating nations, separated by the developed versus developing status. Nations designated as developing include the lowest greenhouse gas emitters, often being particularly vulnerable to and first to experience adverse climate change effects, which is often based on geographic location and the lack of disaster response infrastructure. To see exactly what the U.S. just abdicated responsibility for, let's explore some notable articles and their implications. The Paris Climate Agreement requires that participating nations publicly maintain an explicit, scientifically accurate stance on the urgency of implementing mitigation strategies to maintain total transparency with the general public. Effectively, these stances are to be held at the same level as any credible researcher, essentially curbing climate skeptic or misinformation-backed narratives from running rampant. Additionally, developed nations must recognize the importance of equity regarding the distribution of resources to mitigate and combat the adverse effects of climate change, putting developing countries at the top of the list due to their particular vulnerability. Acting per the data, the Paris Climate Agreement highlights the urgency of reducing our emissions while providing a great framework for cohesive, just international efforts. The Green Climate Fund is arguably the most critical component of the Paris Climate Agreement. It's the world's largest climate fund created to support developing countries in their paths towards sustainability. Currently, the fund is supporting 133 developing countries through their four-pronged approach. Number 1, transformational planning and programming. By promoting integrated strategies, planning and policymaking to maximize the co-benefits between mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. Number 2, catalyzing climate innovation. By investing in new technologies, business models, and practices to establish a proof of concept. Number 3, de-risking investment to mobilize finance at scale. By using scarce public resources to improve the risk-reward profile of low-emission climate-resilient investment and crowd-in private finance, notably for adaptation, nature-based solutions, least developed countries or LDCs, and small island developing states. Number 4, mainstreaming climate risks and opportunities into investment decision-making to align finance with sustainable development by promoting methodologies, standards, and practices that foster new norms and values. So the fund is mandated to invest half of its resources into mitigation and half into adaptation and grant equivalent. Whether it's through investing in clean energy initiatives in developing countries, providing financial and humanitarian support for disaster relief, or just keeping the world on the same page, the agreement and its Green Climate Fund outline the work that can be done when all hands are on deck. We saw amazing international collaboration to ban chlorofluorocarbons through the Montreal Protocol. So why does global cooperation to reduce emissions seem completely infeasible now? The public perception of climate change often contains the image of a skinny polar bear on a decrepit iceberg, or low islands falling off the map, making it easy for the average American citizen to believe that ignoring the leopard face-eating party ensures their faces won't be eaten. But the faces of LA and North Carolina residents have been long digested, and they won't be the last. We are actively witnessing an uptick in natural weather events affecting vulnerable states in the United States Hurricane Alley, a rise in rates of cancer based on geographic proximity to petrochemical industries, and a surge in domestic climate refugees, all of which has been predicted by climate scientists. Greenhouse gas emissions are predicted to rise 36% during the Trump administration, based on plans to expand fossil fuel usage, which will only increase atmospheric carbon dioxide, methane, and refrigerant concentrations. The United States emissions have indeed dropped since the 1990s, but socioeconomic factors lead us to being the second largest emitting nation, behind China, and the largest emitting nation per capita, according to data from 2019 and 2020. The biggest contributors to our high emission rates are our transportation, electricity generation, and industry sectors. Since the 1970s, the United States itself has warmed more quickly than the world as a whole. Populations facing the highest risk of heat-related deaths include adults 65 and older, children, individuals predisposed to cardiovascular conditions, and blue-collar, labor-intensive workers. The obvious response to a rise in temperature is a rise in electricity use for cooling. The more we rely on the grid, the more strained it becomes, increasing the risk of failure and region-wide power blackouts, the cost of electricity, and the eventual use of more fossil fuels. It's a self-defeating cycle that will cost comically more than any initial investment into adaptation and ignoring the well-known effects of continued fossil fuel usage and rescinding apparent undue burdens on energy production is not just short-sighted, it's total self-sabotage. The current disinterest in climate action from an environmental perspective is especially unsurprising when it's paired with the rollback of domestic environmental policies enforced by the Environmental Protection Agency. Policies that protect the nation's access to clean water, prohibit the use of carcinogenic materials in construction, and reduce air pollution. The EPA was created by Richard Nixon to consolidate nationwide initiatives that curb adverse environmental effects on the general population. As concluded in the 70s, properly addressing the health of America's diverse environments is an investment into the future of humanity. So why are we now sacrificing the health of American citizens for the continued use of fossil fuels? As said in Drawdown, because we do not know how long ocean and land sinks will continue to absorb carbon, achieving drawdown requires that we do everything we can to address global warming as aggressively, completely, and thoroughly as possible now. We cared about the rampant spread of malaria, mosquito-borne diseases affecting American troops during World War II and listened to experts on epidemics, so we created the Communicable Disease Center, which later became the Center for Disease Control. We cared about industrial pollution contaminating our air and water sources following the Cuyahoga River fire and listened to the Council on Environmental Quality, so we created the Environmental Protection Agency. We cared about our national security and the rising crime that came with the population boom at the turn of the 20th century, so we created the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So how is it that now, when we are the most advanced we've ever been as a civilization, the richest in knowledge, and fat with opportunity, we've halted proactivity after witnessing LA wildfires, Hurricanes Milton and Helen, and the current D4 drought hitting West Texas? At a time where we're in an apparent national energy emergency, why haven't we put forth the changes that thousands of energy experts, financial advisors, and public health specialists have come to a consensus on? We know that investing in clean energy has and will continue to boost the U.S. economy. Trevor Higgins, an expert in public policy and the senior vice president of the Energy Environment Department at the Center for American Progress, wrote to Congress on the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act, a landmark federal investment into renewable energy, addressing air pollution, improving access to clean water, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions through greener transportation and infrastructure. Higgins wrote, "The law's clean energy investments are laying the foundation for continued climate action in ways that bring benefits to people in their everyday lives and make it possible for the United States to cut carbon pollution to half of peak levels by the end of this decade. These investments are preparing America to compete in the global clean energy economy for decades to come, and more immediately, the law cuts household energy costs throughout the country. High energy prices spike costs across the economy, including for groceries. We know that financial advisors are not in agreement with the introduction of tariffs that will affect our energy sources. Robert Stavins, economist and professor of energy and economic development at Harvard, discussed with colleague Joe Aldi, a former member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and Harvard professor, the early impacts of Trump's domestic environmental policies. The prospect of tariffs generally really interact with an agenda focused on trying to advance oil and gas development in the United States. If we are going to put tariffs on imported steel, the price of oil extraction would go up. So, when importing crude oil, natural gas, or electricity from Canada, with tariffs, it will make those more expensive domestically. I think that we're going to see more and more business investment because the business case for clean energy is getting better and better, even if the policy environment is getting more uncertain. We know that adverse effects of climate change have direct impacts on public health. As discussed by the World Health Organization, climate change presents a fundamental threat to human health. It affects the physical environment as well as all aspects of both natural and human systems, including social and economic conditions and the functioning of health systems. It is therefore a threat multiplier, undermining and potentially reversing decades of health progress. All aspects of health are affected by climate change, from clean air, water, and soil to food systems and livelihoods. Further delay in tackling climate change will increase health risks, undermine decades of improvement in global health, and contravene our collective commitments to ensure the human right to health for all. Now more than ever, it is completely insane and almost pervertedly malicious to examine decades of data on the climate, public health, and economics, only to double down on fossil fuels and shrug off global responsibilities. When did we decide that reactivity instead of proactivity is the best course of action in any context? We can see that the current response to climate mitigation efforts is reflective of the paradox of thrift. Limited adaptation in order to save money brings disastrous, weather-induced crises that cost substantially more than initial investments ever would. A 2019 report showed that for $1 spent on mitigation and adaptation efforts, $11 is saved in post-disaster relief, rising from $4 in 2005. Not only is that cost jarring, but it doesn't even include the destruction of natural resources and loss of life. It's an underestimation at best. Gina McCarthy, former administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, puts it simply: climate change is the most significant public health challenge in the world today. What is the United States, if not the first to rise in the face of catastrophe? Withdrawing has shown that the United States is not only ignoring obligations expected of a global superpower, it's setting a precedent that climate action is optional. Moreover, the pullout represents something that we've been trending towards as a nation and culture since the mid-2010s. A total abdication of responsibility is required of the most powerful country in the world. The United States has been slowly pulling back on its international duties for a bit now, nearly all of which were taken on following World War II and during the Cold War. I'm not interested in discussing exactly how the federal government should act to tackle the national debt and whether leaning into this isolationism will be beneficial for the economy. But it is absurd to think that the rest of the world will wait for us to come to any type of decision. By ditching climate action and doubling down on fossil fuels, the US isn't putting America's health, wealth, or natural wonders first. It's putting us last in the race for a sustainable future. As discussed by world leaders, many of which are long-standing allies, the United States is no longer seen as a reliable entity from a sovereign standpoint. What is stopping them from diverting their businesses, research, and allyship elsewhere? Well, nothing, as they've already started. Ultimately, while the withdrawal's impact on the climate is concerning, it is not the sole catastrophe. The real danger lies in the American public's willingness to accept and normalize systemic backsliding in an era where modern innovation defines national prosperity. We will not just be playing catch-up with our allies or competitors. We will be completely left in the dust. Our country's history, values, and dedication to preserving our strength internationally have brought us directly to being the figurehead of crisis response. Yet when the world needed leadership, the US turned off the alarm clock, pulled the covers over its head, and decided to sleep through the crisis, no matter how unlivable the bed becomes. A core currently undermined aspect of the United States is lifting its head following federal inaction: the power of the states. Members of the U.S. Climate Alliance, including 24 state governors, doubled down on climate mitigation efforts following the announcement of the second withdrawal. In a letter to Simon Stein, Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, they wrote, "Our states and territories continue to have broad authority under the U.S. Constitution to protect our progress and advance the climate solutions we need. This does not change with a shift in federal administration." The director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland, Nate Holtman, estimates that by strengthening existing subnational policies, quote, non-federal leadership could achieve 54 to 62% of emissions reduction by 2035. Not only is there support from the usual suspects, but more than half of the emerging clean energy projects are located in Republican-controlled states and are predicted to generate more than $200 billion in investments, according to Climate Power. The clean energy sector has grown exponentially following the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, resulting in companies investing over $126 billion into the private sector capital. Therefore, it's completely reasonable to remain optimistic that financial benefits derived from climate-friendly actions will leave the co-opted anti-science rhetoric in the past. So, as discussed by Robert Stavins in his analysis of the Paris Climate Agreement 2025 withdrawal, All in all, the real-world implications of the expected forthcoming withdrawal from the U.S. from the Paris Agreement under Trump 2.0 may turn out to be less consequential than some observers have feared, despite the clear abdication of global leadership and the great disappointment that will surely be felt by many in government, environmental advocacy, academia, and private industry. By far, the greater climate policy consequences will be in terms of extensive and severe downgrading of U.S. domestic climate and energy policy, whether via legislation, regulation, or both. Just because the current administration has deemed a transition towards sustainability as unnecessary does not mean that climate inaction is the correct choice. And as I've laid out, it seems to be the worst possible choice, even if we weren't even concerned about solely reducing emissions. And as a final note, the world will not wait around for America to decide its stance on climate action. They will stand up and fill the shoes of forward progress with or without our dedication and support.